Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Michael Dickman, the Chief Product Officer at Gigamon. Hey, Michael, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Justin. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. And, throughout this event, we've been talking about the national cybersecurity strategy and the implementation plan at times. It covers many different areas, of course, but one of the big efforts is modernizing federal cyber defenses. What are some of the trends that you're following in the kind of federal cybersecurity space, and where do we need to go from here?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very active space, as I think everyone who's watching will be aware. A lot of really great, I would say, very important focus on cybersecurity as a core tenet. So as a result, there's been a ton of activity. So I won't kind of cover broadly, but maybe just one specific aspect that I think is important to highlight, because there has been a lot of work on, say, the endpoint side, or the SASE technology, which is really thinking about better ways to have hybrid connectivity. But I think when we think about overall cybersecurity, and we'll probably talk later about different components in the infrastructure around that. One thing that is in that planning and different pieces that have come out of the government, like M2131 and M2218, and all these, obviously the zero trust frameworks, is around how do we make sure that we truly embrace the principles of zero trust, meaning we understand that there will be a compromise at some point. We can't only rely on perimeter defense. And endpoint, in a way, is like a perimeter defense. It's just a new kind of smaller perimeter. And so the question for me that I would raise is, how do we make sure we bring in a cybersecurity mentality also to data in motion, including things like lateral movement within an organization? So within data centers, across and between clouds, between remote sites and users. So data is flowing all of the time. And not only to say, I'm gonna do a really strong authentication, but how do I make sure that I'm monitoring that data in motion, which is visible through network traffic? And how do I make sure that we can detect threats, that we can identify and conform to policy, no matter where that data is going? Because one of the big challenges that we've seen in reality, right, so this isn't hypothetical, is the perimeter defenses and the EDRs fail, not because it's bad technology, but because of social engineering, phishing, all those kind of things. And after that moment, we can't allow it to be open and easy, to go back and forth through the environment, moving data, et cetera. And so that's, I think, where you need a key strategy for cybersecurity implementation that includes watching data in motion, especially lateral movement across and between all these domains.
Yeah, and related to that, what about event logging? I mean, that's really emerged as a
Mhm.
key area. SolarWinds, I think, it came out that a lot of agencies didn't have the logging necessary to really detect the bad actors in their environment. And then I think if you look at last year's cyber espionage event with China breaking into some high-level US officials' emails, the State Department was able to uncover those actors because of their logging capabilities, because they had good cyber defenders looking at that.
Mhm.
What progress have you seen in that area across the federal government? How are we making up ground in that area?
Those are two great examples. I'm glad you raised that. So the first example was a case where we didn't have, like you said, the right logging and visibility of what was happening. And in the second case, we did. And I think that's the reality of the world. So there is a lot of logging that's already happening. And there's an increased focus there. And so what are we logging? Right? We are logging what endpoint devices say they are doing. We are logging what applications say they are doing. And we are logging what is hitting network nodes. So a network node might say, I saw somebody talk to somebody. And an endpoint might say, I saw, this process on my device. But I think one of the gaps in the logging is to have a source of truth of what is really happening. Because what can happen on the endpoint, and again, going back to that social engineering situation, is if an endpoint is compromised, actually those logs can be disabled, or more nefariously, they can be manipulated. And so the question is, am I logging what's really happening, which is data in motion and network traffic? Because the phrase that we always say is packets don't lie, but not necessarily just think about network traffic, but how do I take that approach to logging, which is, like you said, what events are occurring, and apply it to what I know is occurring with certainty. And so something that Gigamon does, my company, is try to pull out insights from the data in motion, things like, hey, who really did talk to who? And so you might have a rogue DNS server, for example. that by definition, is not advertising its location to anyone, but it may be serving requests and doing things improperly. You might have weak ciphers, to have low security on the network that you're not aware of because, again, by definition, those devices aren't logging and reporting that. And so completing that ability to observe what's happening, not only through what applications and endpoints are saying what is happening, but by observing what's actually happening through the network, I think completes the logging. And for a lot of folks in federal, they're probably aware that network traffic logging is actually mandated and a requirement in many cases as well. So you need to achieve the compliance, of course, but I think more importantly is the security aspect around observing with the depth and completeness of network visibility. And I'll just give one example. You might have a case where a database is on premises and a user or an application is somewhere else. And the database might think it's serving a legitimate user, and the user might think it's accessing a legitimate database. Those are not always true assumptions. And the only way to know what is happening is to be able to observe the transaction completely about where it's coming from and where it's going to, and be able to rely on that information with certainty. And that is something you get from logging metadata of network traffic.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. Obviously, those different contextual pieces of information are so important, but you get to a certain point where there's so much data. I mean, what role does automation, AI, things like that start to come into play so that you can actually take all this information and process it at the speed that you need to be able to detect these potential bad actions?
Yeah, no, great question. Hugely important. I think the first thing is to sift out like meaningful information from just stuff, right? So that's why things like metadata would be better than raw data, right? So things like that. But then, you need to, like you said, how do you automate the examination of that and using AI? And there's been a lot of advances in that. And so I think what I see our customers doing, which I think is a great approach, is to either rethink the SIM and expand the definition of what it can do, or adopt modern data lakes or observability platforms. Because what you need to have is, let's bring insight out of the data, which requires automation and correlation. And AI is a perfect tool for automation and correlation, right? Because you can say, hey, this thing happened, why did that happen, and how do I do that in automated fashion? I think the piece that is important to include is that you need to have the complete data to feed the AI so it makes the right decisions. Because by definition, it can't correlate what it doesn't see. And so there's a problem of too much data, but there's also a problem of completeness. And so having more completeness of a smaller volume of data is what will allow that automation and AI itself to be effective. And so, yeah, agree with that 100%. And we've seen customers be successful taking telemetry into a SIM and doing everything there with more automation. And we've seen customers be successful taking a lot of information into a data lake or observability platform and applying AI there as well. And so I think, the different tool, different horses for different courses, if you will, but you have to bring in that automation in today's complex world. Manual inspection and identification detection is not possible anymore.
Yeah, and Michael, one of the things that came out of the national cyber strategy is this need for more cohesion across federal agencies on their cybersecurity efforts. And, I think that's something that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has also been working toward. But traditionally, each agency kind of does its own thing, even though they're all kind of threatened by similar threats. What can you do? What can federal agencies do to sort of break down the different silos and stovepipes in between them to better
Yeah.
defend themselves?
Yeah, it's an important question. And there are silos and stovepipes within organizations, and each organization is itself a silo and stovepipe. So you have these kind of like multiple layers of the risk of a silo. And obviously an attacker doesn't think that way. The attacker is excited to see these silos so that they can be the one to look across them. And again, that's where I think having like firm ground to stand on is important. So first, from a people perspective, there's been a lot of work on information sharing, best practice sharing, some centralized services. I think those are good trends, would be my personal view. And then the other question would be from a technology standpoint, how do we give the right information? So it's not, here's what I see in my silo, what do you see in your silo? But actually, our silos are communicating today. Information is being shared today across domains. And how and where do we see that? And not to look at it from a siloed perspective, but to see that from a centralized point. So one thing I hope comes about is to have those centralized services and shared services, within the federal government in particular, be able to have complete view of data in motion and communications between the silos, and have the silos, or I should say the silos and the agencies and other groups share what's happening within them. And that allows, going back to your earlier question on AI and automation, you can do correlation and automated detection, response, recovery at a much more comprehensive layer. And I think that that's important given the scale and type of threats that we're looking at, which are extremely sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've been talking about what federal agencies are doing to deal with those threats, but obviously, critical infrastructure
Sure.
is another huge target, and about 85% or so of critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Many are smaller utilities, don't necessarily have large budgets for cyber specifically. What can be done to better protect those organizations that are so critical to the functioning of the country?
Yeah, no, it's really important. And actually, Gigamon, we tend to serve a lot of critical infrastructure because our customers are those that have these complex environments. So our own business today already serves a lot of healthcare, financial services, utilities, transportation infrastructure. So very familiar with that. And you're right; those organizations have very complex needs and challenges, but they may not have as large, of IT teams or security teams as other groups may have. So it's a very real challenge. I will applaud some of the initiatives to standardize best practices and policies for those groups, and to provide support, for how those best practices can be adopted. So, for example, I know there's a lot of work in IoT and OT right now to say, hey, let's build in secure by design. Let's have better security practices and how those devices are communicating from the get go. I think it's fantastic. At the same time, we have, depending on the industry you're in, 10, 20, 30, 40-year-old infrastructure, right? Think about a very old piece of infrastructure on, in a utility. Those things are now connected to the internet, but they may not have been designed, recently. So you have these realities. And that's where, again, I think having a way to see what all the data communications are plays an absolutely critical role. So critical infrastructure, a lot of that is IoT and OT, or Internet of Medical Things, IOMT, in the healthcare industry, and that absolutely requires visibility to data in motion in order to provide security for those. So that, I think, is an essential pillar of critical infrastructure in a way that may not be as true for kind of a generic enterprise. And there, I think the federal government can help, with policies and support, as I said. But those organizations also, by adopting, AI and automated practices with the right set of data, can actually get really far by looking at data in motion with consistency, instead of going, each domain by domain, which can be quite intimidating. I mean, imagine if I told you, hey, you got to modernize every device you own, and you have to make sure every single one is perfectly managed all the time before you can even start. I mean, that's just not realistic. So we go down a modernization path as a journey, but along the way, we need to be able to observe the network traffic between everything at every stage, so that as we're on the modernization journey, we're still safe, and have a place to stand on firm ground, across every aspect of critical infrastructure, which includes both, very, very important data, like in the financial and healthcare industry, obvious examples, and very important real life devices that affect all of our lives, like oil pipelines and fusion pumps and all of those. And so, what is the common denominator between things that are that different? Is actually data in motion.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and that valuable data is obviously a huge target, though, for ransomware actors, across
Mm.
different critical infrastructure sectors, from the Colonial Pipeline incident all the way up to Change Healthcare this year, and it just continues to become an issue, or become a bigger issue. What can be done specifically to defend against ransomware within some of these critical sectors?
Yeah. No, it's a big threat. And there's no easy answer, right? Or we would have found it yet. So for better or worse, this is it's got to be an all of the above, approach. I think a lot of the things I mentioned at the very beginning, things like EDR, adoption, microsegmentation, being very careful about data access, those are must-haves, for hygiene and being prepared. In addition to that, the lateral movement that I talked about earlier, being able to see actors move across, that is how the ransomware actors actually do what they do, right? So they find an initial insertion point, which isn't the mission critical data, it's something else. Maybe it's innocuous, maybe it's a privileged user, and then they find their way to that critical data and then encrypt it. And so it's that process, I think, that is maybe underinvested today, which is being able to detect adversaries moving within the network, laterally between users and applications, and even laterally between applications, or between microservices and microservices, not to neglect any of those opportunities. And then one other specific point there, because a lot of people, when they think about ransomware, they think about, hey, someone got to my data and then encrypted it against my will. What they may not realize is that the path to get to that data, the ransomware actor is actually encrypting all of their movement and attack along the way. And so an organization that says, "Oh, I see, this data communication is encrypted; it must be secure," that's really a bad assumption. That communication is confidential, right? If you think about confidentiality, integrity, availability, it is confidential. But what you're actually keeping confidential is the bad movement that the adversary is taking. And so we actually need to use decryption or other ways to see plain text data to identify threats and not assume that encrypted movement is safe. So it's that encryption isn't only a danger when they get to the data, it's how they get to the data that we really have to be watchful. And those are all tools that exist today, and I think can be used much more than they are.
Yeah, really interesting. A lot of great points there, Michael. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So again, I'd like to thank today's guest, Michael Dickman. He's Chief Product Officer at Gigamon. Michael, thanks again.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish best of luck to everybody out there. Thank you.
All right. And I'm reporter Justin Doubleday. You're watching Federal News Network. Let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.